It's great to have everybody here. I'm Steve Crowley. I'm the part of our production team here for our regular weekly Wednesday night Sierra Community Conversations. And so we're really excited tonight to have a great discussion lined up. Tonight we're going to be talking about journalism in the age of COVID. And it's, as with everything else, it's a whole different experience. So I'm going to pass this right along to another member of our production team, Jack Cushman, who's also a member of our Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club Executive Committee and a career journalist himself. So Jack, to you.
Thank you, and I'm glad to see everybody here, and very happy to meet Anne Galloway and Peter Hirschfield for the first time. I'm somewhat of a newcomer to Vermont, and we have here two very distinguished Vermont journalists. And we're going to explore the world of what it's like to be a journalist, and particularly in times as difficult and unusual as those we've been going through. I'm going to ask each of you, please, to give us just a short description of how you see your news organization's roles in Vermont, how you view your job, what are your priorities in the most general sense, and then we'll move through a series of questions. And if at any time members of the audience have questions, if you would please type them into the chat box on Zoom, and we'll take note of those and give you priority in asking your questions. So Anne, why don't you take it away first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jack. It's great to be here with everyone tonight. Thank you for joining us. And my little dog is here giving me some feedback about supper, I think. But I am very pleased to talk with you about journalism and our role in the media landscape as an online nonprofit news organization. VT Digger's been around for about 11 years. And our role has evolved over time. Originally, we were mostly focused on State House reporting, along with investigative reporting, and we've become more of a statewide publication. We have reporters in Southern Vermont, Burlington area, and the Northeast Kingdom, along with a cohort of reporters who are working on statewide coverage from Montpelier about major issues like healthcare, education, the environment, politics and business, and criminal justice. So I see Digger now as a larger player on the landscape than we were 3 or 4 years ago, as some of the larger daily newspapers have suffered as a result of changes in the economic landscape for newspapers across the country. And so, you know, our focus is really daily reporting. We produce between 8 and 12 stories a day on a variety of topics, everything from local journalism to important statewide news. And we, you know, now have 26 people on staff, most of whom are in the newsroom, about 20 altogether in the newsroom. And we're also working to kind of help to train the next generation of journalists. We have an internship program in which we really hook those interns up with mentors who are able to help them learn how to report on a statewide level right out of the gate.
Thank you, Anne. And Peter?
Thanks, Jack, for moderating tonight. Thank you, Steve, and the Sierra Club for hosting this event. One of the happy elements of the pandemic, I guess, is that we're all able to come together from time to time virtually in ways that we might not have been before. Vermont, I'm a reporter for Vermont Public Radio. Our tagline at VPR is exploring the whole Vermont story together, and that might sound trite and cheesy, but we take it really seriously. We see our core role as being to inform and enlighten and bring people snapshots of what's going on in Vermont politically, culturally, across the state. And then we also see ourselves as the largest broadcast organization in the state, radio broadcast, as also being sort of a public gathering spot for Vermonters, a place where people can discuss ideas, where they can interact with VPR in really concrete and meaningful ways that we hope and think advances important conversations and debates in the state.
Thank you. And I'm curious, before the pandemic, for several years, I was the managing editor of Inside Climate News, and we did all of our work online. We rarely met together. Only in the most intense editing sessions would we come together to meet in person. Are you working in virtual offices, or are you ever getting together with your colleagues these days?
Save for distanced outdoor beers with some of my colleagues, I haven't been in the same room with a VPR colleague since March, I believe. And that is a drastic change from the way we did business before. It was a very communal culture. We were very intentional about sharing space together, about seeing each other, making time for meetings where we can bounce ideas off each other in the same physical space. So that really has been one of the more dramatic and unsettling shifts as a result of this pandemic. One, though, I will say I and most other people at VPR are beginning to acclimate to, and it's been pretty astonishing, not just for me, but I know for a lot of other people, what you were able to accomplish, even in the absence of actually being able to meet in person with your colleagues.
How about you, Anne? Is your organization more virtual than before, or were you always that way, or how's it been for VT Digger?
Well, I've always seen journalism as a team sport. And, we were in the office together almost every day. We do have some reporters who are working remotely from the Northeast Kingdom and Chittenden County in southern Vermont, but even those folks would come into the office a couple of times a week. And, there are a lot of incidental conversations that you might have, a lot of just, friendly interaction. And that's all gone away with COVID because we are all working from home, just like the folks at VPR are. We shut down the day after the WHO order came out, and we haven't been back in the office as a team since. And so we have a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of email, and we have a pretty structured system for interaction with reporters. So we have reporters who are assigned to work directly with editors on story development and, interactions about how stories are written or framed or whatever. So, it's still very much a business that's about people, and it's as much about working together as a team as it is about making sure that we're paying attention to what readers need and want to learn about. So it has been a real game changer. It's changed everything about the way we operate, really. But I know we're going to be talking a lot about COVID, so I'll let you keep asking questions.
I would just say, for people who aren't journalists, I don't think it's easy for them to understand what it's like to work in a conventional newsroom. And it's a very dynamic working environment, as I'm sure it is to work in a law firm or in a factory. But the newsroom milieu is really, to us journalists, something very special, and we, I think, all miss it. And I say that having worked virtually as well as remotely, as well as on solo assignments at great distances. But the newsroom is really a special place. Could we talk a little bit about the world of nonprofit journalism? Because both VPR and the Digger, although you have different models, you both get individual membership contributions and grants from philanthropic organizations and are not run on a corporate profit model. Do you feel that this changes the character of your journalism, or do you think that you would be doing pretty much the same thing if you were working, as both of you have, for profit-making entities?
Anne and I actually probably never did work for profit-making entities, though we did work for for-profit companies. So, but Anne,
I used to say I
Anne
went
is the guru of
from unprofitable to nonprofit.
And you are the guru of nonprofit journalism, so I happily defer to you.
Well, that's very nice of you to say, Pete. In fact, by the way, I really enjoyed working with Pete back in the day at the Times Argus when we were there together. And I was the Sunday editor then, and Pete was one of the great reporters on staff. And that was a really fun experience, even though, you know, the paper wasn't making a lot of money at the time. We still managed to have a lot of fun. And that's, you know, what Jack was talking about with that newsroom environment. There's just something about being in one big open space with a bunch of people who are really committed to their work and who are sharing every minute of the day what they're working on, because you can overhear every conversation on the phone. And, you know, there are just so many, you know, wonderful opportunities to talk about the news. And so much of it has to do with, you know, on the fly ethical decisions that we have to make. As far as the nonprofit news business goes, it is a business. It's a slightly different business model in that we don't make a profit, and we don't, all of the money that we make gets plowed back into the operations, and I'm sure that's true at VPR as well. And I think the reason why it was important for me to start Digger as a nonprofit organization was because, number one, there weren't any profits in the news business, you know, at that time. This was at the beginning of the Great Recession, shortly after I was laid off in 2009. And when I wrote a business plan, it just seemed perfectly obvious to me that there wasn't a future for a traditional approach. And I'm not personally wealthy. I didn't have the money to, you know, start a newspaper per se, but I saw an opportunity to use WordPress as a platform, and that was a lucky guess at the time. And I honestly, I looked at the NPR affiliate model, and I looked at what some online news organizations were doing around the country, like ProPublica and Texas Tribune, which were very small at the time, but much bigger than we were. And I thought, you know, there's something kind of beautiful about the kind of relationship that a news organization can build with audience through a nonprofit structure. And I really like the idea of being transparent about where money comes from and how we're spending it. And I like the idea of readers having some real buy-in into the work that we do. And that approach, you know, I think is always about the value proposition. What are we doing for readers that matters? You know, and that's the question we have to ask ourselves every day. And the nonprofit model kind of forces that question, perhaps in a way that it didn't quite so much with a commercial model, in which, you know, for a very, very long time, newspapers made huge profits. And when things started to fall apart, it was just very difficult for newspapers to change quickly. So, as you know, with the way Google and Facebook have eaten up most of the advertising market, now the nonprofit model is sort of the only way to go, I think.
So thank you. We want to talk a little bit about COVID here, and you know, this curse has in a sense highlighted the importance of news coverage, because we're all hanging on every word of the viral developments, and doing so in an atmosphere where not everybody is really being as open-minded or as science-based as they might be. And so in our household, we listen to everything on VPR. We read the Digger's reports, I mean, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. And I find, even though Vermont is a place that has not suffered profoundly from the virus, it has, of course, affected us as well as others, both in the economy and in our health. And so it's just this becomes a reminder of how important news providers are. At the same time, I wonder whether you two find that this pressing story that didn't even exist in our minds in December has overwhelmed what you think you would otherwise be doing in a world without the virus. Have you seen your agenda that you faced as the year began wither away, or is that just the way it always goes in the news business?
My thinking on this, Jack, has evolved over the course of coverage of the pandemic. At the outset, it felt like it was all COVID all the time, and rightfully so. But when I look back at some of the stories that I've had an opportunity to report, which are very similar to a lot of the stories that have been reported in Digger in Vermont, and by news organizations across the country, I can recall going to a family-owned grocery store in Waitsfield during the early days of the pandemic with this idea of, wanting to talk to these frontline food store workers who are literally putting themselves in harm's way to keep the flow of goods moving. And talking with a woman who just fell apart in front of my eyes. I mean, this full body sob, because she was so worried about contracting the virus, bringing it home to her 8-year-old daughter who has asthma. The next day I'm at a restaurant talking to a restaurant owner, trying to figure out how he's going to manage this crisis, this shutdown. And the next thing I know, he's bowed his head and he's just kind of weeping as he's thinking about whether or not he's going to be able to survive this thing. And there are just countless stories like that. And while they're COVID related, what I've come to realize is we're actually covering the kind of sufferings and injustices that have been part and parcel of Vermont, of life in Vermont for a lot of people in this state well before the pandemic. And through COVID coverage, I think a lot of people are developing a much keener sense of the economic strife that exists in this state. We hear about this two Vermonts pretty often, but I think COVID has given us an opportunity to focus in ways that we perhaps didn't before on the level of financial duress that a lot of people in this state are facing, and how that manifests in their lives, and then also the interplay of public and private institutions to prevent or ameliorate that suffering. So while the coverage comes under the banner of COVID, I think the act of reporting on this story has also had the effect of opening our eyes as journalists and also the public that we're trying to serve to a lot of the underlying inequities and really unsustainable financial trajectories that large swaths of our community find themselves in.
We have a question from Midori. Midori, we'll unmute you if you would like to state your question for yourself, and if you don't, then I will read it out.
Well, I can certainly ask myself.
Good.
I was just wondering if it's harder to report on climate change now that the pandemic has kind of stolen everybody's attention, and if you're getting pushback from your editors and things like that in terms of reporting on climate change, which is still happening.
Anne, you want to take that on?
Sure, I'll take that on.
You don't have a boss, though.
Yeah, I am the boss. That's true. Oh boy. I do think that COVID and the economic fallout and the social justice movement in Vermont has really, all of those stories have been evolving, and they've been really important for us to cover as they happen. And so it has been more difficult to write about climate and about the environment more generally. We are starting to get back into that a little bit. We did have a series last year about climate change that was part of a national news effort to really help people understand how climate is changing and how those impacts are affecting states across the country. And we produced a series on that subject last year. And but yes, it has had an impact on our coverage. And I think, we are going to try to get back into that again because it is the issue of our time. Beyond the pandemic is, in fact, kind of an expression of climate change, if you want to look at it that way. And things have happened with the climate as a result. We have less pollution in some places, and there are fewer greenhouse gases because the economy slowed down a little bit, and yet we're having one of the hottest summers we've had, I think, since 2016. So you're right, it hasn't gone away.
Peter, you want to take that on as well?
I've been thinking a lot about this, Midori, and we had an event. It's called News and Brews. It was done in Brattleboro, and this is late last year, before the pandemic. And we hold these events to try to invite the general public to give us thoughts and ideas about what they want to see VPR focusing on from a news perspective. And the overwhelming sentiment at this event was, make climate change your North Star at VPR and commit yourself to covering that story in ways that news organizations just have not committed to in the past. And there was a woman who stood up. She's an environmental scientist at Dartmouth. As members of VPR, myself included, were making an attempt to sort of justify our worth on that front by pointing to some of the climate change stories and climate change projects that we had done over the past year. And she said, your relegation of climate change to a beat in your newsroom betrays your misunderstanding of what climate change is in this state and in this country and to our world. It betrays your lack of appreciation that this is an issue that is embedded in the economy, it's embedded in healthcare, it's embedded in education. And until you include the role of climate change and all the other things that you're reporting on, you're not going to be doing the issue justice. And so one of the things we've been trying to do at VPR, and I'll admit probably not as successfully as we ought to or hope to, but is to look for ways within the context of COVID coverage, within the context of things like social justice, racial justice, everything else we're working on. How does the issue relating to the climate interplay and intersect with all of these other things we're talking about? And that's an ongoing struggle for us, but it's something that we're thinking a lot about, and it really is going to take almost a culture shift within newsrooms, I think, in order to arrive at a place where we're getting the kind of robust and in-depth and substantive climate coverage that the severity of the issue demands.
So I would just comment that I've lived through times in which the impulse of the newsroom at one point was to abolish the environment beat, because in principle, everybody lives in an environment. So of course, all our reporters are environmental reporters, national reporters, business reporters, science reporters, as you say. And yet the strength of the beat system of journalism is that it really is helpful to have an individual who covers the environment beat, as I did during the Clinton administration. And also the organizations that dispensed with this emphasis on the subject by abandoning, say, a climate blog or scaling back a climate desk have come around and reverse course on this and are now mounting very robust enterprise beats with great data journalism, with really very fine human interest reporting. And the wealthiest news organizations can do it, although not all news organizations that are wealthy do this. So I'm glad to hear you describe how you had some outreach on the issue. I would like to hear from you both more about audience engagement in your news organizations, because this is something that's changed a great deal in the past 15 or 20 years, the extent to which our audiences have access to us, have established their own voices, have alternate places where they can publish their views. And news organizations now, of course, are very active in trying to cement these new ties with their audiences. Anne, can you describe how that works at VT Digger?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's really a key one because audience engagement is really tied to the online model in a very serious way. We've had various ways in which people can be involved in evaluating our reporting. We have a report and error function at the end of every story. We also invite people to submit tips. And we hear from between 5 to 10 people a day through those little forms at the bottom of each story. We also hear from people by phone. People call us all the time. They send us individual emails. They make suggestions. And we do our very best to be responsive because we feel it's our obligation as a news organization to really listen and act on what people suggest that we write about. That doesn't mean we can do that on every single tip that we receive, but especially during COVID, we had an opportunity to really be responsive in a way that we hadn't been before, because within a few days, within a week of COVID really hitting hard, we had developed a special live blog on our site. We put together a special daily email. We had daily reports on COVID cases and so on. And this was all in response to reader demand. Readers were just peppering us all with questions and calling. And in fact, there was such an outpouring that we were able to take the tips and kind of we sort of looked at them as in groups, because we'd get 10 tips on the same thing and then 10 on another thing. And we actually put together an FAQ knowledge base to respond to questions about, whether masks were effective, how to bring groceries home safely, how to interact with family, how to self-isolate for a week. And this was really meaningful for our audience because, I think they could see that we were doing our level best to respond. And the more that we responded, the more questions we got. And it was this major feedback loop. And I think our reporters felt really needed in a way that they hadn't felt before, that the reporting they were doing really mattered because people want to survive. I mean, it was really a question of getting through the day, getting through the week, both psychologically and emotionally through COVID. And, I think that that same sense of urgency is much more difficult to, there's less of a sense of urgency around climate in our state, even though we have a number of activists and people who are concerned, and daily there are things that, we see all around us that are an expression of climate change. Tent caterpillars, influxes of various invasive species, the drought this summer. I mean, it's happening all the time, but there seems to be less of a sense of urgency around it. And I think that's what makes it more challenging to address as a journalism outfit. But in terms of audience engagement, all these things we did with COVID and our other coverage led to a huge influx in readership. We went from 400,000 uniques a month to more than 1 million unique readers a month in a very short period of time. And we saw a 30% growth in our email subscriptions and a doubling in the number of people who donate as members. I mean, people were just they were turning to us for help, and we were doing our level best to provide that help. And to me, that is, that's the kind of audience engagement that's hard for any news organization to sustain over the long term. But for about 3 months, that's what it looked like.
At VPR, we're of the belief that audience engagement is the future of news in a lot of ways, and that if you fail to embrace it, your future is going to look pretty bleak. And the question gives me an opportunity to promote and pump one of VPR's flagship podcasts, which is called Brave Little State. And the whole concept for this is people-powered journalism, where we invite our audience to submit questions. We put those questions back to our audience and let them vote on which one they want VPR to cover. And the winning question gets a story, an enterprise story with an enormous amount of time and resources that are poured into it. But the basis for that story, it's the seed is planted by somebody who listens to VPR who wants us to answer that question. It's proven to be an extraordinarily successful model. We're now doing 2 Brave Little State stories each month. We get enormous viewership from those, listenership and readership. So it's been very successful. I'll second what Anne said. It's also extraordinarily time consuming. You can't just say you're going to engage with an audience and invite them to submit questions to you or comments. It really is a relationship that you're developing, and the quality of that relationship, like any other, is going to depend on the amount of time and commitment that you're willing to invest into it. We've begun to try to use a similar model to guide other stories and coverage that we're doing in the newsroom, with some success. And as at VT Digger, emails, tweets, Facebook posts from our audience and members has played a key role in driving not only the stories that we're telling, but who we're talking to tell those stories, and how we go about the process of reporting them. So I think one of the really wonderful evolutions in the news business is this recognition on the part of the people that are doing the news that they would be well served to spend a lot more time listening to the people that they are purportedly trying to tell these stories to.
Thank you. Suzanne Zelliff, you've had some comments and questions in the chat. If we unmute you, would you like to boil them down and give our speakers a little audience engagement?
Yeah, hold on. Sorry, I'm doing my dishes. I always clean when I'm watching reading. Oh no, it seems like I've noticed that the AP, it seems like it puts out whatever time in the morning, so 3 in the morning, the AP just puts out, these are the topics, and all news media across all platforms address those. That's one thing that I just, maybe it's my own promotion, right? But why aren't, I understand reporting for the masses, and I understand doing what's important and what people care about, but when the media and the news outlet is what people do to gain information, why not report more on the environment? Like, it's always taken the back burner, but now it seems pretty much non-existent, or it might be a little fluff piece at the end, like, oh, we cleaned up these turtles who are caught in some plastic. Why isn't it brought forth more? Why is it not brought out to be more important so people will care about it and know it even exists? Like, there's so many things, like, just in the past couple of months with mining rights, hunting rights, reduction of national property, and going into reservations, big dams, big electric projects, just nobody knows. So that's it. Right? Kind of questions in there. Great, good.
That's a valuable observation. When I, like Anne, I was once a Sunday editor, and when you're a Sunday editor, you assemble the material for the big fat paper that would do serious damage if it hit your screen door. And so it was often a matter of putting together a balanced mix for that Sunday front page, which wasn't planned the evening before. It was planned Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And there was a category of story that I used to try to include in our front page offerings, which I used to call Eat Your Broccoli. And to some extent, I believe that environmental coverage at times has to be Eat Your Broccoli coverage. And that you have to, as a news organization, be imposing judgments on what's important on people who have many important things on their plate, but who would really perhaps not have their attention brought to something, even though it's right in front of us all. Do you find that there's an element of that in environmental journalism at your organizations, or is it rather that there's a great demand and people are always saying more broccoli, please?
You know, I think in Vermont, people like broccoli.
I think that's a good observation.
You know, I do think people appreciate environmental coverage in Vermont in a way that they might not elsewhere. I'm not sure. I've lived here too long to know, but I think people here do like to read about the environment and do care. I mean, do care about climate change and do care about what's happening with our lake and what's happening with with our forests. And so I think people do care, and reading about the environment is important to so many here. So I think we obviously need to do more there, and really take this feedback very seriously.
I hope this doesn't sound defensive, and I'm not talking about VPR's work on climate change coverage, but when I look back over the past 3 to 4 years, I can recall off the top of my head well over a dozen instances of top-notch journalism on climate change. Now, that might include books, but there's a catalog of phenomenal reporting, investigative and otherwise, into climate change. And so I'd encourage folks first to curate your media feed in ways that ensure you are gaining access to those stories, because they're being written right now. Incredibly talented journalists are putting an enormous amount of effort into telling them. And it would be a shame if you're just not seeing it because you don't know about that particular publication. So that's the first thing. The other thing I'd say is, I wonder if mainstream media is going to adopt the kind of approach that you're talking about to climate change coverage until the issue grips the public imagination in a way that we, for instance, saw racial justice blow up on the scene in March after a video of a police officer kneeling on a black man's neck in Minneapolis. And one of the questions I'm asking myself during this pandemic is, what does it take for us as humans to respond to outside threats in ways that mitigate or prevent them? And it took a hell of a lot for people to modify and change their behavior in response to COVID-19 before they were willing to do that, right? I mean, it was refrigerated trucks outside emergency rooms in New York City before people were really like, okay, I guess we really do have to stay at home. When I think about that in the context of climate change, it makes me wonder, what will it take? What is the scale of destruction, the toll on humanity that we will need to see with our own eyes before we're willing as a people to modify our behavior and self-sacrifice in ways that are actually going to meaningfully address the problem before us? And I go back and forth on what that threshold is, but sometimes I'm more pessimistic than others.
I think Zara may have a comment to make in this regard. Are you there, Zara?
I think Zara dropped off.
She appears to have dropped off the call. Well, I'll ask her question because it's an obvious connection to what Steve just said. If I can appear at my screen here. Basically, she said, well, don't you think tonight's a good example when we have Hurricane Laura barreling down at 150 miles an hour, stronger than any other? An example of ignoring climate change implications. And I might add, a record-breaking hurricane season in many regards, caused by the warming oceans and rising seas. And at the same time, record-breaking fire season in California. Both of these creating refugees out of hundreds of thousands of people who are unable to seek the conventional shelter because of the COVID virus. And if, hellfire and brimstone flood and you see the National Weather Service saying that a flood surge, a sea surge is going to be unsurvivable. And we asked the same question after Katrina.
Yeah, we do.
But at some point you have to say, well, heck, it's here. And that's Zara's comment, I suppose. And let's see, who else have we got? Sally Burrell, do you have a comment to make? Is Sally still with us?
Hi, yeah, I'm on the Bristol Energy Committee and have been thinking about energy for some years. And it does seem like it kind of comes and goes in popularity and a lot of times it has been really frustrating for a lot of us who've been in it for a long time. So I think it does. I mean, it seems like there are so many disasters that you'd think would catch us on fire, to really, so to speak, on fire. But it also is a really hard thing to work with. It's so big that, it's easy to say, well, it's actually more, it's worse over there, so we don't have to worry about it here. It's really hard. I understand why it's hard to work with, but it also is, I think, getting the young people who really feel it's their future, it is their lives, they're probably trying to decide whether they should have kids or not or whatever. It's so big for them, and somehow collaborate with the older generations who are entrenched in good ways, connected with things. We have to work together and use their energy in our power places that we're in.
Comment from our guests?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Sally. I think it is overwhelming for people to contemplate. What we're really talking about is, the end of life as we know it as human beings. I mean, I think the Earth will be fine. It's the biodiversity that's gonna go. I think that one of the things I find encouraging about COVID is what Pete was describing in terms of people changing their behavior on a dime. I mean, who thought that that would be possible anywhere in the country? And while, of course, there have been some debates about wearing masks or not wearing masks, an awful lot of people have changed their behavior quickly. And one of the things that's happened, I think, is that people are spending more time with their families, and they're spending more time with close friends. And perhaps there's an opportunity for all of us to think more deeply about our values and what we believe is most important in our lives. And that can lead one to think about the public square and what our responsibilities are as human beings at a time when climate change is such a huge issue. But I do think it is depressing and difficult for people to feel that they have any agency. And so how do people feel that they have any say or any way of changing the situation? Well, I think you can look at the social justice movement and see great change there. And I think there are encouraging signs that people want to come together because they care and they have compassion for others. And ultimately, climate change is about that issue too. I think too often, the environment can be seen as too much of an external force rather than something that we as human beings can have an impact on. And but it's sort of hard to know, I think, for a lot of people, what are those steps? What are the ways in which I personally can make a difference here?
So let's talk a little bit about the social justice issues that we have had layered on everything else this year, and these profoundly disturbing events that have resulted in this upwelling of protest. Rob, I think you may have a photo to share with us. Here we have one of our guests covering the Black Lives Matters protest for BPR.
Yeah. So I just want to make some commentary on that. Like, I, as an activist myself who organized lots of protests, I actually myself was scared to death to go to that protest because it was at the peak of the COVID crisis. And then here I am, I'm staying distance away, and I see Pete, you walking right up to there, and then sitting there photographing and running. I thought that was just a classic photo. But it's like, how is your safety? Like, you feel about your safety covering events? And I think of war journalism, but like, what was going through your mind while covering something like that?
Honestly, I mean, I didn't really spend much time. I don't think that in the scheme of things, when you look at the risks that other people in other vocations have to take, that going to a protest where I had the ability to distance, I could wear a mask. So I didn't feel like I was putting myself in any kind of personal danger as a result of that. And the thing that we as journalists, when we go out in the field, are far more concerned about is making sure that we aren't becoming vectors ourselves for the people that we are asking to talk with us about their lives and about what they're going through. We've gotten training on all the precautions we can take to minimize the chances that we contract the virus. I'm not in a high-risk group, and I feel like the threat to me personally is pretty minimal from that kind of work.
I'd like to ask each of you to comment on what, in the course of covering the movements for racial and social justice, what have you learned about Vermont and Vermonters that you didn't perhaps understand before? As I mentioned, I'm fairly new to Vermont, although I'm quite familiar with the state. But when there was an outbreak in Winooski, and I learned that it was concentrated in a marginalized community of immigrants from Africa who spoke multiple languages, I, don't live that far from Winooski, but I was unaware of the presence of that community in our state or of what their needs might have been. And I wonder if there are things that have come to you as revelations in the course of your coverage of COVID and of the social justice issues.
I mean, I think for us, it's been, really surprising to see the pushback from some groups to the protests around the state, the counter protests, and then some of the vandalism we've seen and things like that. I think have been really, a little bit more aggressive than I would have anticipated. Even though we ended up shutting down our comment section finally. In July, frankly, we had so many comments, but we also had so many more because we had so many readers, but so much of it was hate speech, and frankly, our editors were suffering from a little bit of PTSD from it. It was that bad. So, we were aware of a pretty serious racist streak here in Vermont, but that really really came to the fore in our comment section in June and July in a way that we hadn't seen before. It was quite distressing. And then I think, the protests themselves were very big and they lasted a long time. And I think that was really something to see. I wasn't sure how it would play out in Vermont. And I think people here really took the situation seriously and responded. And we did our best to cover everything we could. And I also think that, there were some bills in the legislature that have been stalled for a long, long time. The fact that they banned chokeholds, that's something that I think hadn't really been talked about before. The body cam issue has been something that's come up in the past, and that has not moved. That's been dead in the water for years, and suddenly there was a push to make that happen. And I think that there is a very distinct possibility that more transparency could be brought to bear on situations involving law enforcement in future, and that would be a very positive thing.
For me, and I don't know that this was a revelation, but it was an important reminder of the power of protest to fundamentally change the conversation that's going on in the State House. As Anne was saying, there have been some of these criminal justice reform measures sitting in the legislature for many years in some cases, and there has been a blue wall of opposition in many instances that has successfully kept them on the walls of committee rooms. They just haven't moved because law enforcement unions and officials have convinced lawmakers that either there's no need for them or that the consequences would outweigh the benefits. And we saw that constituency undermined in a matter of days. And we saw pieces of legislation that weren't going to see the light of day suddenly jump to the top of lawmakers' priority lists. And that was directly the result of 5,000 people showing up at the lawn in Montpelier. It was a result of 3,000 people marching through the streets of Burlington. It was a result of smaller crowds getting together in places like Charlotte and Shelburne and Newport. I went to a protest, Black Lives Matter protest in Newport City, organized by a 16-year-old high school student. And so for me, it was a useful reminder of the power of raw organization to influence the conversation in Montpelier in ways that would otherwise take years and in some instances decades to achieve.
I wonder if the two of you find Vermonters to be as split along partisan lines, as intensely split as we see in other states and some parts of the country, or do you think that it's a less sharply divided population?
I think it's becoming more partisan.
What evidence do you see of that?
Well, I think you see it in the primary campaigns. I think you see it in the reaction to social justice issues, to the Global Warming Solutions Act, and even to mask mandates. I think there's a range, and we still have a lot of people in the middle, which is a positive thing. But I think you see a progressive movement in Burlington that is far to the left of moderate Democrats in the city. And then, and that plays out a little bit in the legislature, but less so. And then you have moderate Republicans like Governor Phil Scott and Republicans in the legislature for the most part. And then kind of on the far right, you have the GOP party in the state of Vermont, which is really very loyal to President Trump. So it's, I think, more of a split than it used to be between the progressives and the Trump supporters, and the middle is kind of stretched between those two groups. And I don't think you saw that before. I mean, I think Vermont has been pretty moderate for a long time, despite our support for Bernie Sanders, who's something of an anomaly, both here and nationally. Of course, his mantle is being picked up now by folks in Burlington and elsewhere in a major way, and that's had a huge impact on the country as well. But even Bernie Sanders, I think, is in some ways perhaps not as radical as some folks on the left in the Progressive Party. I mean, you get these commentaries. We get commentaries from Deb Bilodeau, the head of the Vermont GOP, that are very, very aggressive and not at all supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. And I won't describe them further because I'll get myself into trouble, but I think they're pretty aggressive. That's not, that's been the way it has been for a little while with the Republican Party. But when I first came to Vermont in 1988, it was, I think, not quite so extreme.
Well, it's fascinating
Right.
you referenced 1988 because that was 2 years before civil unions.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's like a useful reminder, going back to that moment in time, that we did have that kind of intense partisan rancor. And my sense, and maybe I'm wrong about this, is that Vermonters are dispersed relatively evenly across the ideological spectrum over time. But there are certain stimuli or participants that cause us to see more friction between those different viewpoints at various times in the state. We live in a time right now that is surfacing a lot of those polarizations, and I think that it gives us, it's a good, useful reminder of how far apart a lot of people are politically. But I just think this is something that's been with us since the beginning and will continue being with us. And that Vermont tends to do a pretty good job managing those differences. A lot of us live in small communities. We're able to talk to one another. If you're a Sanders supporter, you probably know a Trump supporter. If you're a Trump supporter, you might be friends with a Sanders supporter. And so that helps people bridge those divides. But sometimes, as we saw at that Support the Police rally in Montpelier a few weeks ago, that Digger had a really great write-up of, things can get nasty.
So our time is about to run out, and our questions have not run out, but we really want to thank you both. I would like to ask a question that I don't want to sound divisive, because it's not meant to be a divisive question, but I wonder how it feels to you when you hear the press generally spoken of in terms such as enemy of the people. And I wonder whether you find in your real life experiences that, as I have found, that the people actually really do not view us as the enemy, but are very supportive of what you do in your professions. Are you able to survive the mudslinging? And at the same time, I hope that you are both able to follow the old motto that we should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So I'd welcome a closing remark from each of you.
The people that I want to engage with more than anybody else right now are the people that think the press is the enemy of the people. The people that think we are apparatchiks for the deep state, who are out to make sure Donald Trump doesn't get reelected, and who are actively trying to bathe the populace in communism and socialism. I think that in order for the country to repair the rifts that we see right now, the media needs to find a way to engage and connect with the people that have lost faith in it. And I think that's going to be a difficult process. It's not one that we can sacrifice our integrity in the process of doing so. But I care far more about what the person that hates VPR thinks than people that think we're doing a really great job right now.
I'd like to tag team on what Pete said. I think that it's really important to listen to people's needs, and it's very important to listen to the criticism. I think some people describe us as the enemy of the people because we represent the people, and that can be threatening to power. And I think that our role really is to be as close to what's happening on the ground as we possibly can be, and to really hear what people have to say and represent that accurately, of course, on the media that we on the mediums we use. But I think really we're part of an ongoing conversation about who we are as a people in America, and that's always evolving, and it shouldn't be a threat. What we're doing is really holding up a mirror to what's happening, and hopefully helping people see some insights in that reflection that help them cope day to day and learn more about who they are and how they fit in the bigger picture. And so I think, if we do our work with care and love, and sometimes a little bit of holding their feet to the fire, accountability stuff too, that we can communicate that we aren't elitists. I mean, I think that unfortunately, sometimes the media has been painted as an elitist institution, and I think that's in some cases warranted because we've not done enough to really represent all people in the country, and we all need to do a better job of that. So we've all got a lot to learn, and I think as long as we engage in that learning together, we'll be able to improve our democracy and to do our work more effectively as leaders in journalism.
Well, thank you again, both. I'm going to turn this back to Steve, and I appreciate the support of our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. That was such a great discussion, Peter and Anne, both. I do want to point out that if you want to share this discussion with other people, it will soon be up on our Vermont Sierra Club website. And I placed the link. There it is. There's the actual page.
Oh, great.
And the link is there in chat if you want to grab that or save the chat. And so this will be up there shortly, as soon as our magician Rob pulls it together. And
Depends on when I want to wake up tomorrow morning to do it.
So everybody, thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. We couldn't get to all the questions tonight. There were some great ones. And again, thanks to our guests, and thanks to Jack for leading our discussion tonight. Rob, do you have any closing?
Yep, I just want to announce to everybody our next conversation that we have scheduled is next Wednesday, and we go back to 7 p.m. instead of doing 8 p.m. because now it's darker. But it's about criminal justice reform in Vermont with James Duffy Lyle, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and also Ashley Messier, who used to work for the ACLU. So just in reference to all these conversations we're having, the diversified conversations about all these issues, not just the environmental issues we're working on. So join us for that. But any of the other conversations can be found on our website under the Community Conversations banner. So thank you. And I'm officially ending this